Good morning. It's nice to see so many of you here. This is my last talk on this cruise. For those of you who are with us on the next cruise, I have a few things to talk about there as well. But for today, I'm going to be talking about someone by the name of Raffles. I want to just repeat what I said yesterday, the thank you to the technical guys who make this place happen. Production manager is Louise, and the team includes Jonas and Eric, and they just pick up what we give them and they make it work every time. So I am very grateful to you all. Thank you very much, guys. Now, if we look back at empires in human history, down here at the bottom is the Portuguese Empire. It is the smallest of this list of modern empires. It is also the longest lived empire in history. It lasted longer than the Romans, the Greeks, and a number of others. At the top, and this is only a measure of territory, the largest empire in history is the British Empire. And I'm going to be talking about some of the key British, but other influences as well, in this area, the area where we are today. Now, I'm sure some of you will have visited Raffles Hotel, this colonial-style luxury hotel in Singapore. It was established by Armenian hoteliers, the Saki brothers, established in 1887. It consisted of 10 rooms at the time. It is now somewhat larger. At the time, it was very close to the beach. They haven't moved the hotel, but they have moved the beach. There's been massive land reclamation there. And its reputation for high standards, both in terms of service and accommodation, it made the hotel very popular with wealthy clients, especially with the British who were visiting and were trading there. And it's also the birthplace of the famous Singapore Sling cocktail, which was created by the Raffles bartender Yang Tong Bun back in 1915. Some of you may have been to the old Long Bar before the place was restored, a time of rather faded glory, or more recently since its very smart renovation in the last couple of decades. But I'm not planning to talk about the hotel. I'm not planning to talk about the merits of the cocktail. I'm not even going to talk about the escaped tiger that was shot in the billiards room in 1902. And I'm not going to talk about its place in movies or history. I'm going to talk mainly about this man, the man after whom the hotel was named. Sir Thomas Stamford Bingley Raffles, Fellow of the Royal Society, Fellow of the Royal Architectural Society. Born in 1781, he died in 1826, and he served as the Lieutenant Governor of the Dutch East Indies between 1811 and 1816. And he was Lieutenant Governor of the Bencoolen Residency, which is now Bengkulu, and I'll show you where it is, in Sumatra. That was between 1818 and 1824. He's best known for founding modern Singapore and indeed the Straits Settlement. So let's have a quick look at the map. Because of the way we're projecting today, I end up standing in front of it, so excuse me. Singapore is here, at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. This is the Straits of Malacca. We haven't actually entered the Straits yet, but we will, and we're going to go to Kuala Lumpur tomorrow. This is Sumatra, Java, the islands of Indonesia, the Philippines are over there. Malaysia is this cream-colored country that leads into the Philippines. We sailed up into the Gulf of Thailand, to Bangkok and Sihanoukville, to Ho Chi Minh City, and we're now heading back this way. We're somewhere around here at the moment, going into the Straits of Malacca later in the day. So if you look at a modern map, you can see Singapore at the bottom of the Malay Peninsula. Malaya, or Malaysia as it is now, and Indonesia are very extended countries that spread over a number of islands. Just repeat again, the white bits of the map are Indonesia, the island of Sumatra to the left, and on the west coast of that is the Bencoolen Residency, somewhere around here. That gets mentioned a few times in this man's story. The island of Java, let me go back to the map. The island of Java is this island here. This is Jakarta, which was known for some time by the name of Batavia. It's important because I'll come back to some of that story a bit later, but dozens of islands off to the right until you get to the Javan half of New Guinea, just above Australia. You can see from the map just how important Singapore is to the trade routes of this area. I repeat what Craig said a few days ago and what I have said before. The Malacca Straits, this section here that we will enter later today, is critical to sea trade between the Indian Ocean and the Far East, because the alternatives are just too narrow or too shallow. Trade has to come this way, and control of the Malacca Straits was essential hundreds of years ago, just as it is essential today, as Craig explained to us the other day. But first I'm going to talk about some of the main players in what was to be the development of the Indonesian archipelago, the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. We'll come back to the map a bit later on to try to help keep things in perspective. The Dutch East India Company, originally the United East India Company, in Dutch, and please my Netherlands colleagues excuse my pronunciation, but the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, known as the VOC, was founded in the Dutch Republic, what we know today as the Netherlands, in 1602 to protect the country's trade in the Indian Ocean and to assist the Dutch War of Independence from Spain. The company prospered through most of the 17th century as the instrument of the powerful Dutch commercial empire in the East Indies, what we think of today as Indonesia. It was dissolved in 1799. Now, as I've discussed in my talks before on colonial expansion, the Spanish and Portuguese had long been competing for the spice trade in Asia. The United East India Company was formed after individual Dutch merchants rebelled against those Spanish and Portuguese contracts in Asia. The Dutch, quite understandably, weren't at all bothered what the Pope might have said about who should have control of these lands. And at the same time, English privateers had captured many ships from the east, forcing the price of goods, like pepper, for example, to rise dramatically. So the Dutch companies formed together in the VOC to protect their trade and their stocks. And in doing so, they formed the first stock exchange in the world. They were a private company, but they had effectively state-like powers in the countries where they took control. They could mint their own coins. They made trading laws for trade outside of European waters. Well, this is some currency issued by the VOC. It has its monogram and the date of production on its obverse and the coat of arms of Holland on the reverse. And during the 200 years of its existence, the VOC issued large quantities and many different patterns of coins. Where the Portuguese had tended merely to control trade routes in Asia, the Dutch actually wanted to get deeper control. So they took control of the production of spices, they bribed local rulers, or in some cases by conquest, they created monopolies in order to keep the price up and to ensure supplies. The Dutch, as we know, had brilliant navigation skills. They took advantage of scientific leaps that were happening at the time, and their travels immensely enhanced the lives of Europeans. Not only did they bring some really rather elegant new products back to Europe, China teacups, for example, silks, but they also brought back information on the flora, fauna, and exotic society of this part of the world. Probably one of the most famous members of the Dutch East India Company, especially for the Australians and New Zealanders amongst us, was Abel Tasman, a Dutch seafarer, explorer, merchant, best known for his voyages of 1642 and 1644. He was the first known European explorer to find New Zealand and the islands of Fiji and Van Diemen's Land, which we know today as Tasmania. But that's a whole other conversation, and I don't have time for that today. Batavia, you remember I said Jakarta was known as Batavia? Batavia was the capital of the Dutch East Indies. The area corresponds pretty much to modern-day Jakarta. The founding of Batavia by the Dutch in 1619 on the site of the ruins of Jayakarta led to the establishment of a Dutch colony. Batavia became the center of the Dutch East India Company's trading networks in Asia. But this wasn't easy. For instance, in 1775, 370 VOC soldiers arrived in Batavia. Within 2 years, 70% of them had died. By the 17th century, the VOC had declined as a trading and sea power and had become more and more involved in the local affairs of Java. By the 18th century, it had changed from a commercial shipping enterprise to a loose territorial organization, interested in the agricultural produce of the Indonesian archipelago and what was to be exported from there. And towards the end of the 18th century, the VOC became corrupt and ended up in serious debt. The Dutch government eventually revoked its charter in 1799 and took over its debts and possessions. I had a glass of water here just now. Never mind. If you like a good yarn, try this. In 1629, the ship Batavia, which was the pride of the Dutch East India Company, was wrecked on the edge of a coral archipelago, about 50 miles off the west coast of Australia. Most of the people on board, nearly 300 men, women, and children, were saved from drowning. But they became victims of a rather visionary psychopath who, with the help of dozens of followers, organized a methodical massacre of this hapless community. There are several good books and stories about this episode. My favorite is the one on the right of the screen. Thank you, darling. Just have a drink. It's written by Peter Fitzsimmons. It's called Batavia, and his version of the story combines in just one tale the birth of the world's first corporation, the brutality of colonization, and the battle of good against evil. The other one worth having a look at is the one on the left, the wreck of the Batavia and Prosper. That's written by sinologist and author Simon Lees. He traveled to the site of the disaster, and he learned, paradoxically, that the natural environment of the islands could quite easily have afforded the survivors a fairly decent standard of living, recognizing that they were shipwrecked. Here we see the coat of arms of the City of London, and I'm wearing my City of London pin today. As you probably know, it's the City of London is a city within a city. The greater city is the City of Greater London. The city was originally confined by its old Roman walls. It's now a ceremonial county and local government district, and it contains the historic centre of London. It's known as the city or the square mile, and it constitutes the central business district, CBD, of London, alongside Canary Wharf, a little bit further along the Thames. And its guilds of merchants are crucial, central to the life of the city. They were originally granted their freedom by William the Conqueror. So my pin has its origins in 1067. And it's a tradition that continues to this day, and I'm very proud to be part of the City of London as a freeman of the city. London merchants presented a petition to Queen Elizabeth I for petition to sail to the Indian Ocean, planning to break the Spanish and Portuguese monopoly that I talked about the other day, the monopoly on trade, of course. In 1599, a group of prominent merchants and explorers met to discuss a potential East Indies venture under a royal charter. The group included Stephen Soame, who was then Lord Mayor of London. Just as an aside, you may have seen some of the story of the declaration, the proclamation of King Charles III and his accession to the position after the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. This is the Mansion House in the City of London, and this was the first place that the Royal Heralds went to after the declaration of the Privy Council. I'm not going to cover how I fit into it as a freeman today, but if you're interested, you want to know a little bit more, then buy me a drink. So Queen Elizabeth I established the East India Company. This is the British East India Company as opposed to the Dutch East India Company. The British East India Company, the East India Company, was known as the Company. It was established by Royal Charter in 1600, and initially their interests were in spices from Indonesia. I've explained already that the overland routes were always limited, and the Venetian control of the waters of the Mediterranean made things just as difficult by sea to get to the Middle East and beyond. So it was important to find sea routes, and the British relied upon the sea routes around Africa, which were discovered by the Portuguese. There were perilous journeys at sea. Pirates, I talked about them yesterday. The waters were very dangerous, especially where the Atlantic meets the Indian Ocean. But the rewards were very high. Nutmeg, mace, peppers, small, very light cargoes to carry, but very, very lucrative. The merchants needed to raise many resources, and as a result, shares were issued in the cargo, not just in the company. Investors often had to wait 3 years for a return on their investment. It was very risky, but the results could be very high yields. Ships of the East India Company were called East Indiamen, or simply Indiamen. Their names were sometimes prefixed with the initials HCS, which stood for Honourable Company Service, or as some people preferred to say, Honourable Company's Ship. Soon they found that the Dutch had already sewn up Indonesia, so they turned to India for fabrics, gems, and minerals. They didn't want to pump large amounts of gold and silver into India, so they did deals with the huge Mughal empire using local agents. At this time, it was all about trade rather than conquest. They established small fortresses around the periphery of India, and if you have been there, you will have seen some of these, I know. Gradually, the Mughal empire started to fade, and the British Indian Army became stronger. Remember, this is an army controlled by a corporation, and it was used in many British conflicts, for example, against the French during both the American War of Independence and the Napoleonic Wars. But when Britain lost its American colonies in the 18th century, interest shifted back to India, crushing the control of the local dynasties to establish British domination. And this is a whole other subject, but this is another example of British officials drawing lines on maps and ignoring traditional tribal, or in this case, dynastic territories. But that's a subject for another talk. So the company was now governing on behalf of the British government, using the huge army that it had created. At its peak, the British East India Company, the company, a private trading company, remember, had a fleet of 130 1,200-ton ships. It commanded an army of 200,000 troops, and they dominated the Indian subcontinent. From its foundation in 1600, it lasted 258 years. And during this time, it funded governments, it toppled princes, it generated spectacular amounts of money from trading textiles and spices. It had redrawn the map of India, built an empire, and reinvented the fashions and foodstuffs of Britain. But in the aftermath of the Indian Rebellion in 1857, and under the provisions of the Government of India Act 1858, the British government nationalised the company and took over its Indian possessions, as well as its administrative powers, machinery, and its armed forces. And by this time, vast amounts of opium were being grown to trade with China for tea. And if you were with me on my first talk, you will have heard me talk about that in some detail. I'm not going to go through the whole story again, but after the Opium Wars with China and the introduction of tea cultivation into India in the 1850s, the company interest became more based on the tea trade. In fact, the company remained in existence in vestigial form, continuing to manage the tea trade on behalf of the British government, until the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act came into effect in 1874. We've had a whole other talk about that. I don't intend to divert into that now. Just a couple more images of historical context. The English and the Dutch were both participants in the 16th century European religious conflicts between the Catholic Habsburg dynasty and the opposing Protestant states. And everyone was seeking profits everywhere in the world. This led to both the Dutch, the VOC, remember, and the British, the company, to become embroiled in a series of conflicts, mainly fought between their governments from the mid-17th to the late 18th century, looking to control trade and overseas colonies. In the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and these, remember, were at the end of the 18th century through to 1815, France reduced the Netherlands to a satellite and finally annexed the country in 1810. But with the establishment of British naval superiority at the Battle of Trafalgar and the eventual defeat of Napoleon, Britain effectively seized all the Dutch colonies from France, and with the signing of the Anglo-Dutch Treaty in 1814, Britain returned all those colonies to the new kingdom of the Netherlands, with the exception of the Cape, Ceylon, and part of Dutch Guiana. The 1814 treaty was to be tidied up a little bit later, about 10 years later, but both the treaty and the subsequent changes were to have some effect on our man, Raffles. So let's move on to the man himself. Thomas Stamford Bingley Raffles, born on the 5th of July, 1781. He was actually born on board a ship, the Anne, off the coast of Port Morant, Jamaica, to Captain Benjamin Raffles and his wife, Anne. Benjamin served as a ship's master. He was engaged in the direct trade between England and the West Indies, which we've also talked about over the last few days. Now, some biographies have suggested that Benjamin was involved in the slave trade. Actually, modern historians believe that that probably was not true. But when he ended his involvement in the West Indies trade in 1800, his family ended up in quite severe hardship. The little money that the family had went into sending the young Raffles to the Mansion House Academy in Hammersmith in London. It was a moderately priced boarding school, offered Latin, Greek, French, arithmetic and bookkeeping and geography, and it specialised in preparing boys for clerkships or for the army. In 1795, at the age of 14, Raffles started working as a clerk in London for the British East India Company. 9 years later, in 1804, the now 23-year-old married Olivia Marianne Devonish. She was a widow. She was 10 years his senior, and at 23, that's quite a big difference, really. In 1805, he was sent to Prince of Wales Island, Malaya. So let's just get this right. This is the Malaysian Peninsula. Singapore is that bit down at the bottom. Thailand is above it. And here is what was known as Prince of Wales Island, which you see on the other side of the screen. Today, we know Prince of Wales Island as Penang, and it is quite well known. And this started his long association with Southeast Asia. He started with a post as Assistant Secretary under the Honourable Philip Dundas, the Governor of Penang. And at the time, he also made the acquaintance of Thomas Otto Travers, who would accompany him for the next 20 years. His knowledge of the Malay language, as well as his wit and personality and his ability to get on with people, gained him favour with the Governor-General of India, and he was sent further south to Malacca. I remember I showed you the Malacca Straits earlier on, and there he was installed as the Lieutenant Governor of the Dutch East Indies. That was in 1811. That was after the annexation of the Kingdom of Holland by France, and Raffles had to leave when Holland was annexed by France. He mounted a military expedition. Did I just say it was after? No, it was before, but when France annexed Holland, he had to leave. He mounted a military expedition against the Dutch and the French in Java and around the Dutch East Indies. The war was swiftly conducted by a well-organised British army against an opposing army of mostly French conscripts with poor leadership, to say the best. And during the relatively brief British rule in Java, Raffles negotiated peace, mounted some significant military expeditions against local Javanese princes. He also placed some restrictions on the local slave trade, which was very close to his heart, and that was in line with the wider British policy. But remember, at that point, he wanted to stop slavery. Slavery was still happening. Raffles himself was served by a large retinue of slaves at his official residence in Java, so there was some conflict there. He also attempted a replacement of the Dutch system of forced agricultural deliveries in kind with a more cash-based land tenure system of land management. So under Raffles' aegis, a large number of ancient monuments in Java were systematically catalogued for the first time. The first detailed English language account of Prambanan was prepared by Colin Mackenzie. His great-grandson is a good friend of ours. While the Buddhist temple at Borobudur, which some of you may well have visited from Samarang, it was surveyed and cleared of vegetation and documented for the first time. But under the harsh conditions of the island, his wife Olivia, remember 10 years older than him, died in 1814, and this absolutely devastated Raffles. In 1815, he left again for England, shortly before the island of Java was returned to the control of the Netherlands following the Napoleonic Wars. Raffles had been removed from his post by the East India Company ahead of the handover, and he was officially replaced by John Fendall Jr. The reason for his being replaced was stated as poor financial performance of the colony, and there were also allegations of financial impropriety, although they weren't proven. He sailed to England early in 1816 to clear his name, and on the way he visited Napoleon, who was at that time in exile in St. Helena. but he says that Napoleon was unpleasant and unimpressive. In 1817, Raffles wrote and published The History of Java, describing the history of the island from ancient times, as well as its geography, its flora, and its fauna, which were very important to him. And that same year, he was created a Knight Bachelor by the Prince Regent, who became George IV. At the publication of the book, he also stopped using the name Thomas, preferring to use his middle name, Stamford, probably because there was some confusion with a cousin who was also called Thomas Raffles. So in 1818, he married his second wife, Sophia Hull, and they later sailed to Bencoolen, which was a possession of the British East India Company on the west coast of Sumatra, down here. And remember, this is on the other side of the island from the Straits, Malacca Straits, which is the most navigable route from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. And it's important to remember that. The territory of Bencoolen was about 300 miles along the southwestern coast of Sumatra, centered on the area of what today is known as Bengkulu City. The company established a presence there in 1685 and 1714. They built Port Marlborough there. Raffles arrived in 1818, and he was appointed Lieutenant Governor. Raffles was troubled. He found he was in a colonial backwater. The only real export was pepper, and only the murder of a previous resident, Thomas Parr, gained it any attention back home in Britain. He found the place wrecked, and he set about reforms immediately, mostly similar to what he had done in Java. He abolished slavery, he limited cockfighting and that sort of thing, and to replace the slaves, he used a contingent of convicts sent to him from India. It doesn't sound that different to me, but yeah. At this point, British East India had two main ports. Penang, which I showed you earlier on, in northern Malaysia, and Bencoolen on the east coast of Sumatra. Let me just show you those again to remind you. Penang is up here, Bencoolen is down here. These are the Straits of Malacca, so crucial to trade in this part of the world. The Dutch ports around Malacca and Java were closer. It gave them more control of the straits and effectively cut off trade between Penang and the other important trading centres at the Malay archipelago. The British East India Company therefore needed a new port south of Malacca to protect British ships, and so they chose Singapore. It had a lot of drinking water, it had a good location, and it was at the centre of the straits. Raffles sailed to Malacca in 1818 to personally secure a British presence in the south of the Malay Peninsula, particularly Singapore. That was his favoured location. Lord Hastings, who was the Governor-General of India, had a less than stellar opinion of Raffles. But the now well-connected and successful Raffles was able to secure permission to set up a settlement. The city was in a strategically advantageous position, but he had been ordered not to provoke the Dutch, and his subsequent actions were actually disavowed by the British government. In London, Lord Castlereagh, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, attempted to quell the Dutch fears, and continuing efforts were made to reach an agreement between the countries, and this eventually became the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of London of 1824. As well as the treaty, instructions were sent out to Raffles to undertake far less intrusive actions. But the long sea journey between London and the Far East meant that the orders had no chance of reaching him in time. After a brief survey of the local islands, he established a post on the southern tip of Malay Peninsula, just to the south of Johor. He worked out that there was no Dutch presence on the island of Singapore, So contact was made with the Sultan of Johor, Abdul Rahman. Members of Raffles' party surveyed the island, and a few days later, on January the 30th, 1819, a formal treaty was signed by a man who claimed to be the Sultan. He was, in fact, Hussein Shah, who previously had had very little contact with the British. He was the Crown Prince of Johor, but while he was away in Pahang to get married, his father died, and his younger brother was made Sultan, supported by some of the court officials and by the Dutch. But Raffles was able to charm the man and to reassure him that once under British protection, the Dutch posed no threat to him in the area, and to circumvent the situation of having to negotiate with the other Sultan, who was heavily influenced by the Dutch, Raffles decided to recognize on behalf of the British Crown Hussein Shah as being the rightful ruler of Johor. And this is the agreement which was signed on January the 30th, 1819, by His Highness Sultan Hussein Mohammed Shah, granting the British the right to establish a trading port. Raffles declared the foundation of what was to become modern Singapore, securing the transfer of control of the island to the East India Company. There was lots of pomp and ceremony. Official treaty was read out aloud in a number of different languages, and Sultan Hussein Shah was paid some 5,000 Spanish dollars a year. Abdul Rahman, the man who thought that he was already the Shah, received the Sultan received $3,000 a year. These are enormous sums by modern standards, equivalent to more than $300,000 to one and $200,000 to the other in modern currency. William Farquhar was officially named the resident in Singapore, and Raffles was named as agent of the most noble, the Governor-General, with the states of Riau, Lingayen, and Johor. Orders were given to Farquhar to maintain free passage of ships through the Strait of Singapore. This was the most critical part of his job, and a small military presence was established alongside the trading post. And after issuing orders to Farquhar and to the remaining Europeans, Raffles left the next day. By all accounts, the running of day-to-day operations on Singapore was mostly done by this man, William Farquhar. But Raffles was the one who got all the credit. Farquhar's honeymoon in this job was short-lived. His life was made very difficult by Raffles' grand plans for Singapore, while insisting it stayed a free port. In Farquhar's view, this policy was a recipe for disaster, as it undermined his ability to raise sufficient funds to construct and run the city, according to Raffles' plan. The situation was further complicated by the dismal postal service in the region, which rendered any communication virtually impossible with Raffles, who was now stationed back in Benicoolen, you remember the other side of the island of Sumatra. Farquhar contributed a lot to Singapore, including having put 1 shilling, that's $8 by modern standards, to anyone who killed a rat, for every rat killed, to prevent cholera in this small colony. He widened the roads, he eased traffic through the island, cleared vegetation for farming, used timber to build houses to accommodate the fast expanding population. Unfortunately, he also introduced a number of changes to Raffles' plan and instructions in order to generate much needed revenue for the seamless operation of Singapore. He allowed the establishment of gambling dens, as well as the sale of arak. You may have tasted arak. It's a rather strong alcoholic spirit. And opium. He also permitted cockfighting and the building of homes on land which was, up to then, reserved for British administrative buildings. Raffles saw these developments as vices and was opposed to the privilege the Sultan and his brother enjoyed. In addition to the large sums that they received as proceeds from the opium and arak trade and the gambling dens. This was all eventually to lead to Farquhar's fall. Meanwhile, Raffles had returned to Benicoolen. He wasn't very well, but as his health improved, he continued on his quest to learn about the island he now called home. He studied the Batak cannibals of Tapanuli and their rituals and laws regarding the consumption of human flesh. He wrote in detail about their transgressions that warranted such an act, as well as their methods. He also noted the rise of Sikh religion in certain parts of the island. And while in Sumatra, Raffles commissioned artists to make drawings of his collection of animals and plants, and the surviving drawings are held by the British Library. Food production was a problem, and Raffles paid attention to the agricultural methods of the Chinese in order to learn from them. But even as Raffles lived like a country gentleman and ran his colony like an estate, his expenditure on nature presentation was seriously frowned upon in both Calcutta and London. There were also great personal tragedies for the man. 3 of his children died during a dysentery epidemic in 1821. The couple were devastated, as you can imagine. As Raffles grew restless and depressed, he decided to visit Singapore before retiring and heading home to England. Accompanying him would be his wife, Sophia, and their only surviving child, Ella. So when he got to Singapore in 1822, he was pleased to see that Singapore had grown exponentially in such a short period of time. The colony was now a bustling hub of trade and economic activity. But he wasn't at all happy with Farquhar, and the straw that broke the camel's back occurred when Farquhar sanctioned a return to slavery in the new colony, which rendered all attempts at appeasing Raffles absolutely ineffective. In 1823, prior to his final departure from Singapore, Raffles removed Farquhar from his post as resident commander, effectively ending his illustrious career for a man who had achieved quite a lot. John Crawford was appointed as the new resident commandant, and he signed a second treaty with the Sultan and his brother, which extended British possession to most of the island. Raffles instituted new policies, set up a new committee headed by the colony's engineer, Philip Jackson, to draw up a plan, which is known as the Jackson Plan, or by some as the Raffles Town Plan. It was based on instructions from Raffles. It was still racially segregated, giving the best land to the Europeans, yet it was considered remarkably scientific for the time. Raffles also supervised the levelling of a small hill south of the Singapore River to create Commercial Square, which we now know as Raffles Place. And in the final few weeks of his stay in Singapore in 1823, Raffles drafted a series of administrative regulations that aimed to govern Singapore in a fair manner. They also reflected his stance on various moral and social issues. He outlawed gambling, imposed heavy taxation on what he considered to be the social evils, drunkenness, opium smoking, and he banned slavery. A police force and magistracy were set up on British lines, turning a trading post into a proper city with some semblance of order. And the Raffles Institution, which later produced a number of famous Singapore notaries, was established. In 1823, feeling that his work was done, he left Singapore. He boarded a ship for home, but not before a stop in Batavia to visit his old home and his old adversary from the VOC, Godet van der Capellen. Final stop in Bencoolen followed, and then tragedy befell once more when his youngest daughter, Flora, born just a few weeks earlier, died while still in Benicoolen. He turned to his other great interest of botany and zoology, and among other things was a founder in 1825 and the first president of the London Zoological Society, which is to this day the owner of the London Zoo. But there were arguments with Farquhar, and they challenged each other's reputations. Raffles was not only not granted a pension, but was called to pay over £20,000 in sterling for losses incurred during his administration. He died at Highwood House in Mill Hill in North London on his 45th birthday of apoplexy. His estate amounted to £10,000 sterling, and this was paid to the company to cover some of his outstanding debt. But his singular determination certainly laid the grounds for Singapore today, a vibrant commercial city, home to one of the largest specialist orchid centres in the world, the largest cargo port in the region, world-leading casinos and a tourism business that attracted 18 million visitors pre-pandemic. It's a little way to go to get back to that. Its success was due to several reasons, including the opening of the Chinese market, the advent of ocean-going steamships, the dramatic reduction in the time and cost of shipping to Europe after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, and the production of rubber and tin. In 1877, para rubber seedlings were shipped from Kew Gardens, and there were 11 of them successfully planted at the Singapore Botanic Gardens, which I'm sure Laurel will advise you to visit later on. It's believed that these plants were the source of the rubber trees that started the rubber industry in the region, giving the empire an independent source of the raw material without having to rely on supplies from other places. In World War II, Singapore was conquered and occupied by the Japanese Empire from 1942 to 1945, and when the Japanese surrendered, Singapore reverted to British control, with increasing levels of self-government being granted, resulting in Singapore's merger with the Federation of Malaya to form Malaysia in 1963. But social unrest and disputes between Singapore's ruling People's Action Party and Malaysia's Alliance Party resulted in Singapore's expulsion from Malaysia, and it became an independent republic in 1965. This was the view from our hotel a couple of weeks ago. I wonder what Raffles would think of it today. Please join Laurel to find out more about the place today at 6:15. Thank you very much.